Hello, friends. Welcome to the Peace and Power Ukraine podcast, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history, where East meets West and freedom meets totalitarianism. Thank you for joining us during these unprecedented times for peace negotiations that's impacting Ukraine, Russia, Europe, the entire world. As always, I hope to bring more light and heat as we dig deeply in conversations with guests from across the public policy spectrum. We have a great one today. Dalibor Rohac is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies European political and economic trends, specifically Central and Eastern European, the European Union, the Eurozone, U.S.-EU relations, and the post-communist transitions and backsliding countries of the former Soviet bloc. He is concurrently a research associate at the Wilfrid Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels and a fellow at the Anglo-American University in Prague. Welcome, Dalibor.
Gary, it's great to be with you.
Yes, I am excited today to talk about so many things, including your recent op-ed in the New York Post. But first, I want to begin with the headlines and make sure that we discuss where do things stand with President Trump and Vladimir Putin's relationship during these negotiations. There seems to be new TikTok each day. There's push from Trump to establish a 30-day ceasefire, but that's not what we have so far. So where do things stand today on April 2nd as we record?
I mean, it's really hard to provide running commentary on negotiations that are, for the most part, kept away from the public eye for very good reasons. But I think it is fair to say that when President Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours, that was a promise that was never really intended to be taken literally. And we are now seeing how difficult it is to make even the least significant of advances in these negotiations. And I think the reason for these difficulties is something that might not be fully appreciated by the administration, namely that there is a massive gap between what Russia perceives its interest to be and what the United States perceive our interest to be in Ukraine, and bridging that gap is not going to be easy. And on the Russian side, it would really require giving up on some of its maximalist war aims, which do not really accept the possibility of anything short of Ukraine's capitulation and essentially regime change and a granting of veto to Russia over Ukraine's politics in the future. So we saw these efforts at small partial ceasefires, energy infrastructure ceasefire, and a ceasefire in the Black Sea. And what I found striking about both of these is that basically Ukrainians more or less unconditionally said yes to the U.S. administration, whereas the Russians used both opportunities to extract concessions. And with the Black Sea ceasefire, the condition announced by the Russians and supposedly agreed to by the Americans involves essentially allowing for exports of fertilizer and grains from Russia, and with the lifting of sanctions on banks financing such commerce, which would be an unprecedented return of Russia to the global financial markets. I'm not sure it's warranted. But we have to, I suppose, wait and see whether either of those two ceasefires is indeed implemented.
Right. Do you think that maybe we're reaching a new point in Putin and Trump's relationship based on the comments where Trump said maybe he was, quote unquote, pissed off because as Putin has been dragging his feet, not moving more quickly? Could that be a wake-up call and a pivot point in their relationship now that Trump is threatening different sanctions regimes coming back?
Frankly, I think that's our best hope. And I think that's what Ukrainians are hoping for, that eventually, sooner or later, Trump will run out of patience with Russia, because very clearly Russia is not negotiating in good faith. There was no indication on the Russian side that really they would be willing to accept anything short of Ukraine's capitulation, and they can dress it up in different ways. They can talk about the root causes of the war, but in the end, it really boils down to this question of whether the problem that we are facing in Ukraine is one of a territorial dispute, or one in which Russia is really trying to annihilate Ukraine as an independent, self-governing nation that can chart its own course. And I am almost surprised that it's taking so long to sort of become clear to this administration. But my hope is like the hope of the Ukrainians is that sooner or later it will become obvious, and then really Donald Trump, for the sake of appearing strong on the global stage, or for the sake of not being seen as being taken advantage of by the Russians, will snap back, and maybe then we'll finally negotiate from a position of strength.
Yep, good point. I know that you're a reader and researcher. One of the things I've been reading recently is the story of the United States General William Harrison, who negotiated on behalf of the U.S. with the North Koreans at Panmunjom in the 50s. So as we were trying to wind down that conflict, which I think we can see some parallels between negotiating that armistice or ceasefire, whatever we call it, in Korea in the 1950s, to possibly the solution now. It's been very eye-opening and enlightening, but in particular, the idea that what's built into the negotiating DNA of communists, and I believe that Russians at core are still operating on a communist DNA, is to delay and obfuscate. And that when Trump walked into this thinking he could quickly get to a resolution, he wasn't understanding that communist DNA that's probably built into this negotiation. It's going to take a long time, maybe months. Would you agree?
I do agree. And I have to say, I was frustrated to no end with the previous administration. I have my criticisms of the current administration's approach, but one thing that is encouraging to some extent is that Trump, did not give away all of the leverage that we have over the Russians. So one decision that was taken at the end of the Biden administration was the expiration of the generalized 8L license that allows for the financing of Russian oil exports. That was set to expire in March. And I think there was some trepidation about whether Trump would essentially allow Russia to earn additional revenue on the global oil and gas market. And the administration let those licenses expire, which I think is a good move, and actually does put some pressure on the Russian budget. And I think the mindset with which the United States should be going into these negotiations is really one that kind of assumes the worst about a negotiating partner, and one which is willing to back whatever agreement we have with force. Remember that in Korea, we still maintain a presence of over 30,000 troops enforcing the ceasefire that's been in place for the past 70 years. And the idea that we can just do without that in the context of Ukraine seems fanciful. Obviously, Europeans are stepping up. I think we should be encouraging them. We should not be undercutting their efforts to deploy a sort of peacekeeping force to Ukraine. And in the end, I don't think that peacekeeping force is viable without some sort of American backstop. I mean, we are the ones who have the full nuclear escalatory ladder, and we are the ones who can provide that peacekeeping force with logistics, transport, all kinds of kind of NATO embedded support that really would be very difficult for Europeans to do without.
Yep. Very, very powerful points. Related to that, before we get to the op-ed, I promise, I did want to connect in what the U.S. senators have been talking about with freezing the Russian, the $300 billion in assets and using those as further leverage. It was a bipartisan group of senators on the 25th who came to the table and said, this is another tool in the toolbox we can't forget about, similar to that oil negotiated deal that you mentioned.
I think that is an important conversation to be had. The challenge is that out of those 300 billion, almost 200 billion is sitting in the European Union. And the EU has moved ahead with using that money as a collateral for loans that are then being used to support Ukraine, but there is a degree of reluctance to simply seize the assets and use them towards helping Ukraine, because that would supposedly open a whole can of worms in terms of legal challenges, could destabilize the financial system in the Eurozone. At least that's what the Belgians, who hold most of these assets, argue. And also it's not clear that it would be feasible given the current setup of the EU, where you have very skeptical voices coming from Hungary and Slovakia, among other countries, with regard to Ukraine. So I wish we made more progress on that front. I think there are different ways of addressing these challenges, but I think it would ultimately be a very helpful step, if only to signal to the American taxpayer that we are not on the hook for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and that it will be Russia that will be paying for all the damage that it has inflicted on the Ukrainian economy.
All right, great. That's a valuable insight. Now, under your op-ed, New York Post, March 28th, entitled, "Putin Proves Again He Cannot Be Trusted, He's Out for Domination." There's one line I wanted to share in particular in the second half of that op-ed that I thought was very powerful. Quote, "The war in Ukraine may sometimes seem static and thus pointless, but the picture from the battlefield hides its fundamental instability for Russian public finances. With deflated oil and gas revenue, a labor shortage, and interest rates above 20%, the Russian economy and its military production are bound to hit a wall in the coming year or two. Bailing them out now to produce a partial ceasefire or peace deal that Putin will promptly break is bad policy." So tell us more about why you feel as strongly as you do about the precarious nature of the Russian economy, and why that should fit in more into our Western mindset and American thinking.
I think the starting point of this is that the political support for Russia's war against Ukraine seems to be broad-based, and the war the special military operation, as they call it, seems to be enjoying majority support, but that support runs pretty thin, and that support seems to be contingent on the fact that the war has not really affected the wider Russian population in a deep way. So Putin has been very reluctant to mobilize additional reserves. So now he's pushing with the mobilization of 160,000 men between now and the summer, but he's been very cautious in how he plays that, partly because that has repercussions on the wider economy. And the Russian economy has been reorienting towards war production increasingly, but again, it is not the aim of the regime to inflict real economic hardship on the Russian population. And as a result of that, there are massive fiscal and external imbalances that are accumulating in the Russian economy. There is this manpower shortage, which is only partly compensated for by migrant workforce from Central Asian countries and elsewhere. Oil revenue has fallen. People who say that sanctions don't work, I think, miss the fact that it's far more costly for Russia to export oil using a shadow fleet of uninsured tankers than simply rely on pipelines as they did before. Now they only have 2.5 customers for their oil, and obviously those customers pay reduced prices for those supplies. So there isn't a lot of leeway in the Russian budget, in the Russian economy, for an indefinite continuation of this war. And in a way, what would a premature ceasefire do? It would provide a helping hand to Putin, especially if it involved, as it seemed initially the case, a normalization of the economic relationship between Russia and the United States. And I think that is one of Russia's biggest asks every step of the way. They want to be kind of brought back to the global financial markets. They want to regain access to export, their traditional export destinations for their oil. And I think it is important that the administration resist the temptation to grant them that, even if they try to reach some sort of a ceasefire or partial or full one.
Fair enough. Dalibor Rohac, let me say it this way. When I think about the American mind, we're familiar with the two most Russian defeats, and that's in Afghanistan. That was a military defeat because so many of the troops that were lost were to mothers in Moscow instead of mothers in Siberia and the stands. Then the second defeat, the Soviet Union collapse, was primarily one of an economic nature. So your argument here is that defeating them economically is the prerequisite to negotiating any kind of military ceasefire from a position of strength. Is that fair?
I think that the military defeat and the economic pressure go hand in hand. Ultimately, sanctions are going to change Putin's behavior if he's really ideologically committed to this idea of conquering Ukraine, only insofar as it ties his hands when it comes to military production and his defense industrial base. So I think we have to keep pressure on both sides. And I think we have to remember that Russia can be different from what it is like today. And military defeats in the past have prompted soul-searching and reform, albeit not always successful, in Russian and Soviet past, whether it's Afghanistan that brought Gorbachev to power or whether it's the war with Japan, 1905, that then prompted a wave of reforms aiming at political liberalization, albeit, again, very, very short-lived one. Putin is 72, 73. He won't be around forever. I think we have to think about, what Russia looks like after Putin. His regime is deeply personalistic. There is nobody obvious that he can simply hand over this power structure in a way that would not be destabilizing. And I think it is in our interest to try to set conditions in Russia in a way that will be conducive to eventual liberalization, opening up, and return of democracy.
So help us understand. What you're saying is Putin has no obvious heir apparent. There's no son or daughter or close son-in-law or somebody he's going to hand it off to. For a lot of Americans, they think back to maybe Saddam Hussein and, okay, he had these sons lined up, and Fidel Castro, desperate, he had another brother. What's the situation from a family structure?
So Putin is keeping, I think, most of his family members out of the public sight. When Russians talk about potential successors, they would typically bring up names of people in the security apparatus who are close to Putin. But the feature of the regime that Putin built is that it's a very personalistic regime in its essence. It's a regime in which Putin is the one who has the compromat on everybody, who is managing all the deals himself. And it is very difficult to sort of hand that nexus of kind of knowledge and kind of informal mafia-like contracts to somebody else. And I think it is likely that there will be a lot of infighting if he were to leave the scene. And that is obviously perilous, but it can be also an opportunity.
Right. Very powerful. That's good insight. I hadn't thought about the family structure before. Let's flip around a little bit and think about the Ukrainian side. I just saw that the other night was the first time in weeks that there wasn't a massive missile and drone attack on the country. I think there were just maybe like 2 missiles that were shot down, but no drones that were fired. I know you've traveled to Kyiv in the recent past and throughout Europe, but what's their mindset as they undergo this typically a nightly barrage? Are they still willing to continue to fight for the long term with this kind of status quo stalemate?
So I've traveled to Ukraine 3 times since the war started. I'm going again in May to Odessa. My sense on all of these occasions was one of extraordinary resilience among the civilian population, and people just carry on with with their lives. And in some ways, if you kind of set aside the nightly disturbances caused by drones and missiles, from which Kiev traditionally has been reasonably well protected, thanks to the presence of several Patriot batteries protecting the city. People are, it's not obvious that there is a sort of big war going on, and I think Ukrainians themselves are well aware that sense of security, very thin one that really enables them to live their lives and, go to restaurants and coffee shops and have kids in schools, etc., is one that's being paid for dearly by everybody who is serving in the Ukrainian military. But they also understand that there really is no alternative. I mean, as long as their neighbor to the east is committed to conquering Ukraine, turning Ukraine into an appendage of Russia, they have no other option but to fight back, and that's what they are doing. And really, I think in the sort of talk about negotiations and land deals and which of the regions should be in whose hands and what happens to the nuclear power plant, which seems to be kind of the transactional approach, if you will, embraced by the administration, I think it's really worth remembering that we really are dealing with a regime in Russia that is evil in just so many different ways. And you and I have had this conversation before. Our mutual friend Nikola Kuleba has been a very vocal advocate of children's rights in Ukraine and beyond. And I think, this example of something like 20,000, maybe even more children kidnapped to Russia, I think is one that really we should be kind of bringing up repeatedly and just sharing with fellow Americans, because I think it is such an important and kind of powerful feature of this war that just sets it apart from territorial conflicts. I mean, this really is a genocidal action that Russia is involved in: kidnapping children, Russifying children, denying their identity, changing their names, destroying families essentially, and doing everything so that Ukraine doesn't have a future. And I think it is horrifying, and it has to be confronted as such.
Thank you for bringing that up again, Dalibor. We've talked about that many times on this podcast, and it needs mentioning every single time because of the pure evil that's involved and the contrast in views that it shows from the Russian mindset to the Western-oriented Ukrainian mindset. I've also been to Ukraine 3 times since the full-scale invasion. My sense from the people is they're not asking for all of this assistance in terms of money. What they're asking for is weapons to defend themselves, and then asking for the legal assistance and negotiating assistance to get back their children. Those are like the practical things. They're not asking for meals and food and those things. After 3 years, they have stability on. They want weapons to defend themselves, and they're not asking for U.S. troops even.
I think that's right. I mean, obviously there are forms of assistance that we should be providing. Ukrainian economy seems stable and in a sort of reasonably good condition. You go to an ATM, you can get your money. There is no rationing. Restaurants are open, etc., etc. And that's partly a feature of the fact that the West, the European Union, and also the United States have extended significant financial assistance to the Ukrainian government, which obviously is spending almost half of its budget on defense right now. And I think it is actually something that we not do out of charity, but it is in our interest to keep the Ukrainian state afloat financially, that we keep Ukrainian economy afloat financially, because it would be, we would then have to kind of help Ukraine out of a much deeper hole at the end of this war if we just let things run its course. And we've seen there are many examples from history when countries that kind of switched on full-fledged war economy found it very difficult to come back and bounce back after the war. And so I would sort of caution against a overly zealous effort to cut waste and go after wasteful spending. Obviously, there would be waste and fraud involved in every domain of our international assistance, including the one to Ukraine. But by and large, there is very little indication that there would be kind of wide-scale fraud or waste. And indeed, much of the financial assistance that goes to the Ukrainian government has been well administered, including through a trust fund run by the World Bank that has ample experience in kind of administering similar programs in very corrupt, very difficult environments all around the world.
Right. Yeah, you're not saying there isn't any fraud, any corruption in any system. There's going to be some, and the Ukrainians have had examples recently where they've made public those kinds of incidents that they have dealt with. But there is, especially in year 3, there is much more accounting and transparency, and that's been demanded and that's been given. But there's no perfect system. I want to go back to the beginning of our conversation because there's one part we didn't strike on in these negotiations, and that's the mineral deal that's been talked about. We have this ceasefire concept that's been discussed with not attacking energy or infrastructure, navigation of the Black Sea. But the mineral deal that hasn't been signed yet is still at the heart of everything. And it is an economic partnership that puts Ukraine and the U.S. in bed together, but at what cost for Ukraine? Do you think we're any closer than we were when the White House blow up happened a month ago?
Well, that's a good question. So maybe to take a step back, I think the original idea of the minerals deal was to kind of try to frame the subject in a slightly new way, and one that would be perhaps more amenable to a new administration which has this transactionalist reputation. You can't really appeal to values, you can't really appeal to the liberal international order, so you appeal to kind of material interests of the United States. And I think it was worth running the experiment. I think Senator Graham was one of the early proponents of the minerals deal. My colleague at AEI, Mark Thiessen, has written about this repeatedly. I think Ukrainians themselves would bring it up. I think President Zelensky back in September was sort of articulating an early version of this. But I'm not sure it has kind of played out the way it was intended. So it looks like sort of President Trump would kind of read the first half of Mark Thiessen's op-ed about the minerals and forget all about kind of all the caveats about how we have to, honor our end of the deal by providing security guarantees going forward. And I think there are also kind of, I think, substantive problems with this idea, and also kind of political challenges. And the substantive issue is that when you talk about rare earth minerals, the dirty secret about rare earth minerals is that they're not that rare. What makes them rare is that they're very often difficult to mine, and mining them has big environmental and other costs, so that most Western countries in Europe or in the United States, we are not really sort of building new mines for gallium or lithium or nickel and those kinds of things, and we prefer to rely on the supply chains that are controlled by the Chinese. We don't really know how much of these reserves Ukraine has that would be kind of mineable in an economically viable way. These numbers that we've heard very often rely on old geological surveys. It's not obvious how much of a kind of sell it would be to open new mines with sort of damaging in sort of environmental ramifications. And also some of these big mineral deposits are either on Russian controlled territory or close to the Russian controlled territory. So I think there's a sort of danger in overselling this idea of mineral deals and of sort of these mineral deposits as being the silver bullet. But to me, the political problem is the more important one, because I think the focus on what we can get out of Ukraine kind of obfuscates what our real long-term interest is in Ukraine. I guess it would be nice to build new supply chains for rare earth minerals that do not involve Russia. And it would be great if Ukraine were part of it, just like other countries. I mean, Latin America already has a mining industry. We should be very active there, trying to sort of wrestle those mines away from the Chinese. But I think our real interest in Ukraine has nothing to do with minerals. I mean, it's really this question of whether we can allow Russia to overtake neighboring countries and destroy them, and also present a real long-term threat to NATO and the Western alliance. And I think that's what we should be sort of focusing on. And I think that should be the thing that's guiding our thinking. If we can get, minerals deals in the process, that's nice, but it shouldn't be the sort of driving force of our policy making in Ukraine. Even if there were no minerals in Ukraine, I think it would be worth standing with the Ukrainians and providing them with the assistance that they need to defeat Russia.
That's a very good point, and I think that motivation is the right thing to start off with. But secondarily, if you're the Ukrainian people and you're trying to survive another 4 years, let me ask you this question as we begin to wind down our conversation. I have thought they need to get on the right side of Trump, to where Trump wants to pivot to China. He doesn't want the headache, I think, of Ukraine. Whether that's right or wrong, that's maybe his mindset. So if you can get on the right side of the Chinese threat and come to Trump and say, we're going to be a partner in rare earth minerals and security, and we're the leading experts on drone technology. We're going to partner with you in all these ways and be your greatest ally to deal with the threat of the Chinese. Doesn't that provide the foundation of a better partnership for at least these next 4 years?
I mean, it's probably the best framing that is available to the Ukrainians right now. Am I 100% sure it's going to work? Unfortunately, no. I mean, we live in a fairly sort of unhinged world right now, where you are not really sure what this administration's China policy is, as you see with TikTok and other sort of Chinese related questions, whether they have to do with trade or other issues. The question of the extent to which President Trump himself is kind of part of this real bipartisan consensus that has emerged over China, to me, is a very much an open one. But it is probably the best shot that the Ukrainians have at real success with the administration. I think it's really important that they don't blow it by kind of inviting China in. I think the Chinese have good interest in trying to insert themselves into some of these conversations, and in fact, the more ambiguous U.S. policy towards the alliance is, towards NATO and Ukraine, the bigger the space that the Chinese can potentially fill. So it really goes both ways. But I mean, I do hope that the value of the transatlantic relationship and the role that Ukraine plays in Europe and in that whole landscape just will become exceedingly clear to everybody involved, and that we'll sort of get through these difficult years in a way that makes Ukraine a valuable member of this community of Western democracies.
Yes,
because they really have so much to teach us right now. When you think about defense procurement, drone industry, modern warfare, they know more about it than really any other European or Western power at this point.
Right. Well, one last question, Dalibor Rohac. I want to ask it this way. Like, we see these threads where Ukraine's at the center of the world, and everything runs through the relationship with the EU and China and Russia, and all of these geopolitical questions get tied up in Ukraine. It's just amazing every time I have one of these conversations with you. But if there's one thing that you really want our listeners and viewers to understand that maybe we didn't touch on, one crystallizing truth, what's that last thing to share with us? You'll be kicking yourself if you didn't share it as we close out.
Look, for me, Ukraine is an extraordinary story of sort of national renewal. I'm from a small Eastern European country, Slovakia, that, like Ukraine, was kind of handed its independence almost by accident in the early 90s. I don't think there was a particularly strong kind of separatist independence movement either in what was then Czechoslovakia or indeed in Ukraine. And I think both of our countries kind of struggled to fill that independence with meaning for a very long time. I think in both places, and I think in Ukraine in a very flagrant way, political elites treated statehood, nationhood as an opportunity to enrich themselves, to strike, all kinds of dodgy deals, and basically run around the place like a mafia state. And in both of these places, and Slovakia had more luck because we were closer to the EU and NATO and had a viable path in, but in Ukraine there was this real kind of uprising over time at several occasions that culminated in this sort of reorientation of Ukraine towards the West. I mean, it's together with the Georgian population, like we really have a nation that is just so enthusiastic about everything that has to do with Western democracy, free markets, the sort of values that really I sort of grew up with as essential to human flourishing and freedom and human dignity. And I think it would be such a mistake to kind of close the door on this nation and let them out in the cold, subjected to Russian predation. I think it would be detrimental, most importantly to us and to our souls. I think that's my deeply held belief.
Great place to close us out. Dalibor Rohac of American Enterprise Institute, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for that prescient point to end us on. I've experienced that too. They are truly, the Ukrainian people are Western oriented, and they want to be with the West, and that's what's fundamentally driving Putin crazy. He can't stand that. So we'll leave the conversation off today. Thank you for being with us, friends. We so appreciate you being part of this. Please like, subscribe, and do all of those things that you can to continue to help us reach more today at the Peace and Power Ukraine Pod. Thank you. See you next time.